What did people do for fun before smartphones? Before television? Before even the printing press gave most people something to read? Life in the Middle Ages was tough. It was often short, and the line between celebration and survival was thin. People are people. They found ways to connect, to compete, to laugh, and to forget their troubles for a little while. And one of the most common ways they did this was over a drink. We think of medieval drinking as just endless flagons of ale slammed on wooden tables. But it was more than that. It was social, it was structured, and it was full of games. These weren't just simple ways to get drunk. They were tests of skill, wit, luck, and sometimes just plain physical endurance. They were the social lubricant of a world that desperately needed it. But most of these games are gone now, buried in old texts, forgotten poems, and the dusty corners of museums. Or what if we could dig them up? What would they tell us about the people who played them? And could they still be fun today? Number 19, could you outsmart a pot of clay to get a drink? Imagine sitting in a tavern. It's loud, it's smoky from the central fire. Someone brings out a jug. It looks weird, it's a puzzle jug. The body of the jug is covered in holes, a lattice of pierced clay that makes it look like a sieve. There's a challenge written on the side, a little rhyme that basically says, "Here is drink for you to take, but don't you spill it for goodness sake." The game is simple. Figure out how to drink from it without wearing your ale. This wasn't just a simple trick. These jugs were feats of engineering. The secret was usually a hidden tube built into the handle. The potter would craft a hollow handle that ran from the bottom of the jug up to the rim. The rim itself would also be hollow, with several spouts sticking out, but only one of these spouts was connected to the tube in the handle. The others were dummies. To win the game, you had to cover all the dummy holes and the main opening with your fingers, creating a vacuum. Then you could suck the ale through the one correct spout, like a straw. If you missed a hole or tried to pour it, the ale would pour out through the pierced body all over your lap. These jugs were especially popular in England and the Netherlands from the 14th century onwards, but their design shows a level of playfulness that we don't often associate with the medieval period. The pottery expert Peter Bears, in his book The English Country Pottery, details how these were common in taverns and at festive gatherings. They were a form of entertainment provided by the establishment. The loser, soaked in ale, would often have to pay for the wasted drink and buy the next round. It was a spectacle. The whole tavern would watch, shouting advice, laughing at failures, and cheering the rare success. It was a test of logic and observation under pressure. The jugs themselves became more elaborate over time. Some had intricate designs, multiple handles, or complex systems of internal pipes that made the puzzle even harder. They were a testament to the potter's skill, not just as a craftsman, but as a game designer. Finding one of these in an archaeological dig tells us more than just what people drank from. It tells us they valued cleverness, they enjoyed a good-natured prank, and they loved a challenge. It was a social object designed to create a moment of shared experience, whether that was humiliation or triumph. But what don't we know about this clever game? Were there famous puzzle jug makers known for their particularly devilish designs? Did certain taverns become famous for having a jug that no one could solve? How many variations of the internal plumbing were there? And were some secrets passed down only from master potter to apprentice? And were they ever used in more serious context, perhaps to test a suitor's intelligence, or as part of a guild's initiation rite? Number 18, how do you play a game with a sheep's knuckles? Long before dice were perfectly machined cubes of plastic, people used what they had. And what they had in abundance were animal bones. Knuckle bones, also known as astragali, were the original dice. They came from the ankle bones of sheep or goats. These bones have 4 distinct, non-symmetrical sides, which made them perfect for games of chance. They weren't like modern dice with 6 equal sides. Each side had a different probability of landing face up. This added a layer of complexity and strategy to the games. The game itself could be simple. Players would throw a set of 5 knuckle bones. The goal was to get a certain combination of sides facing up. The 4 sides were often called belly, back, hull, and tongue, each with a different point value. A game might involve trying to get all 5 bones to land on the same side, or a specific combination of different sides. And, of course, this was easily turned into a drinking game. Fail to get the right throw, you drink. Get a particularly good throw, You choose who drinks. Archaeologists find knucklebones everywhere, from Roman villas to Viking longhouses to medieval castles. They were universal. The historian Richard C. Bell, in his book Board and Table Games from Many Civilizations, notes that knucklebones were one of the most widespread gaming implements in human history. In the medieval context, they were a game for everyone. Soldiers played it in their barracks, monks played it in their monasteries despite rules against it, and peasants played it in the fields during a break. They were portable, durable, and free. The drinking aspect made it a tavern staple. A set of knucklebones and a cup of ale was all you needed for an evening's entertainment. It was a game of pure luck, which made it accessible to everyone, regardless of skill. But there was also a physical dexterity component in some versions. Players would toss one bone in the air and have to pick up the others before catching the first one, similar to modern jacks. Fumbling the catch meant taking a drink. This combination of chance and skill made it endlessly replayable. It was a way to pass the time, settle a small debt, or just decide who bought the next round. The clatter of sheep knuckles on a wooden table was a common sound of medieval leisure. But what are the missing pieces of this ancient pastime? Did different regions have their own unique rules and names for the sides of the bones? Were there loaded knucklebones, subtly carved to favor one side, just like crooked dice? How did the church's view on gambling affect the playing of this seemingly innocent game, and were people punished for playing it? And did the specific animal the bone came from matter, with some believing a bone from a prize ram was luckier than one from a common ewe? Number 17, would you bet your drink on the flip of a coin? It's one of the oldest and simplest ways to make a decision, heads or tails. In the Middle Ages, they called it cross and pile. Most medieval coins didn't have a person's head on one side. Instead, one side was typically stamped with a cross, while the other side, the pile, was the side struck by the lower die in the minting process, often featuring a monarch's name or a different symbol. The game was as straightforward as it gets. One person flips a coin, another calls cross or pile in the air. The loser drinks. This game was so common it became a part of the language. To live at cross and pile meant to live precariously, your fate left to chance. It was the game of the undecided, the bored, and the impulsive. Soldiers used it to decide who would take the dangerous watch. Friends used it to settle a friendly argument, and in the tavern, it was the quickest way to turn drinking into a game. There was no setup, no special equipment beyond a single coin, and no rules to learn. It was pure 50-50 chance. Edward II of England was known to be a fan of the game, though his courtiers apparently thought it was beneath a king's dignity. The chronicler Jean Froissart, writing in the 14th century, mentions games of chance being played in military camps during the 100 Years' War, and cross and pile would have been among the most common. It was a simple way to break the tension before a battle or while away the long hours of a siege. Its simplicity was its strength. It could be played anywhere, anytime, by anyone. The drinking version would have been fast-paced. A group could sit around a table, flipping a coin in turn. The loser of each flip would take a drink, or a pot of money or a round of drinks could be staked on a series of flips. A best of 3 or best of 5 could decide who had to pay for everyone's ale for the rest of the night. It was a game with no pretense. There was no skill to boast of, no strategy to debate. It was just the raw appeal of a gamble, a moment of suspense as the coin spun in the air before your fate and your sobriety was decided. Yet, for a game so simple, many questions remain. Were certain types of coins considered luckier than others? Did people develop elaborate ritualistic ways of flipping the coin, believing it could influence the outcome? How often were cheating scandals involving weighted or double-sided coins a source of tavern brawls? And did the symbols on the coin, the cross versus the pile, carry a deeper superstitious meaning for the players beyond just being two sides of a gamble? Number 16, could a roll of parchment decide your fate? This game is more about wit than luck. It was called Ragman's Roll. The name comes from a series of rolls of parchment on which Scottish noblemen were forced to sign their allegiance to King Edward I of England in the late 13th century. The original documents were a symbol of submission, but like many things, the name was co-opted for something much more fun. The game involved a roll of parchment with various verses or couplets written on it. Each verse had a string attached. A group would gather, and each person would choose a string without seeing the verse it was attached to. And they would then pull the string and the verse would be revealed. This verse would describe their character, tell their fortune, or, in a drinking context, give them a command. The verses were often humorous, satirical, or rude. One person might be crowned the King of Fools for the night, while another might be labeled the Village Gossip. The commands would be drinking related. You pulled the string of the thirsty knight, so drink your ale with all your might. Or, the miser's verse is your sad fate, so you must pay for your mate's plate. The game is mentioned in the 14th century poem Piers Plowman, where it's listed among the pastimes of the common folk. It was a literary game, but you didn't need to be literate to play. The host or one literate person would read the verses aloud, adding to the communal nature of the game. It was a form of party entertainment, a medieval icebreaker. The roll itself could be a prized possession, with a family or a tavern owner adding new verses over the years, some becoming inside jokes for the local community. The creativity was endless. The verses could be tailored to the specific group of people playing. If a known braggart was in the group, a verse mocking his boastful nature was sure to be included. If a young couple was courting, a romantic or cheeky verse might be written for them. The game was a reflection of the group's social dynamics. It combined the thrill of chance, which string will you pick, with the pleasure of language and humor. It was a way to poke fun at each other in a structured, safe way. The drinking was the penalty or the reward, but the real fun was in the revelation of the verses. But what has been lost to time about this clever parlor game? Who wrote the verses? Were there well-known poets who created Ragman's rolls for wealthy patrons? Did the rolls have illustrations to go along with the text? How were the rolls physically made to ensure the strings didn't get tangled and the game remained fair? And did the game ever take a darker turn, with the verses used to reveal real secrets or settle old scores under the guise of a game? Number 15, how fast could you pass the cup? Wassail is a word we associate with Christmas caroling, but its roots are in a much more boisterous and communal drinking tradition. The word comes from the Old English wassail, meaning be in good health. It was both a drink and a ceremony. The wassail bowl, often a huge, ornate wooden or silver cup, would be filled with a warm, spiced ale or cider, sometimes with roasted apples floating in it. The ceremony involved passing this bowl around a group, with each person taking a drink and offering a toast. The game aspect came from the ritualized call and response. The first person would raise the bowl and shout, "Wise hail." The rest of the group would respond, "Drink hall," which means drink and be healthy. Then, they would drink and pass the bowl to the next person, who would repeat the toast. This tradition is ancient, mentioned in records dating back to before the Norman conquest of 1066. The historian and monk Bede, writing in the 8th century, described similar communal drinking rituals among the Anglo-Saxons. It was a fundamental part of social gatherings, from the King's Hall to the village green. The game could be simple, don't be the one to finish the bowl, or you have to pay to refill it. Or it could be a memory and speed game. Each person might have to add a new line to a song or a story before they drink. If they hesitate or repeat a line, they have to take an extra large gulp. In some versions, the bowl had to be passed and the toast completed within a certain rhythm or chant. Breaking the rhythm meant a penalty drink. It was a game about community and participation. You couldn't just sit quietly in the corner. You were part of the circle, part of the toast. The wassail bowl itself was an important object. Some were passed down through generations. And they were a symbol of hospitality and togetherness. The act of sharing a single cup was a powerful gesture of trust and friendship in a time when life was often filled with conflict. It wasn't about getting drunk quickly. It was about a slow, ritualized sharing that affirmed social bonds. The drink was just the medium for the real purpose, reinforcing the community. But what are the hidden details of this ancient tradition? Were there specific recipes for the wassail drink that were believed to bring better luck or health? Did the order in which people drank from the bowl have a strict social significance based on status or age? What were the full lyrics to the songs and chants that went along with the game, most of which are now lost? And how did people deal with the hygiene of dozens of people drinking from the same cup? Or was this a concern that simply didn't exist in their worldview? Number 14, could you lie to your friends for a sip of ale? This game is a medieval version of poker, but played with dice. It was called mum chance. The name itself suggests silence and secrecy. It was a game of bluffing. Players would have a cup to roll their dice, keeping the result hidden from the others. The goal was to get a certain combination of numbers, but the real game was in the betting and the lying. A player would roll their dice under their cup. They would look at their results. Then they would make a claim. I have 2 6s. The next player had a choice. They could either accept the claim and try to roll something better, or they could challenge the first player by saying, "Show me." If the first player was telling the truth, the challenger had to drink. If the first player was lying, they were caught, and they had to drink. The tension came from not knowing who was telling the truth. Mum chance was popular in the late Middle Ages, particularly in England and France. It was known as a silent game because much of the communication was nonverbal: a raised eyebrow, a confident stare, a hesitant glance. It was a psychological battle. You had to read your opponents. Is their confidence real, or are they bluffing with a terrible roll? The game is mentioned by name in documents from the 15th century, often in lists of games that were banned because they led to gambling, arguments, and dishonesty. The church, in particular, frowned upon games that encouraged deceit, even in jest. In a tavern setting, the stakes were drinks. Each lie, each successful bluff, each failed challenge would be punctuated by someone having to take a drink. It was a slow-burning game, not a frantic race to get drunk. The pleasure was in outwitting your friends. A successful bluff, making someone drink when you had nothing, was a huge victory. Being caught in a lie was a moment of public, but good-natured, shame. It was a game that revealed personality. The cautious player, the reckless bluffer, the keen-eyed observer all would have their moment to shine or fail. But what are the unrecorded rules of this game of deception? What were the specific dice combinations that players were aiming for? Did players develop a secret code of signals or tells, like modern poker players? How did the game change when played for money versus just for drinks? And were there legendary mum chance players, famous throughout their town for being impossible to read? Number 13, what if your cup was designed to trick you? Similar to the puzzle jug, but with a different kind of trick, were fuddling cups. These weren't a single jug, but a set of 3 or more small cups, all linked together by a network of hidden tubes and handles. They looked like a cluster of individual cups, but they were a single interconnected puzzle. The challenge was to drink from one cup without spilling the contents of the others. The trick was that the cups were all connected internally. If you tilted the set to drink from one cup, the liquid from the others would flow through the hidden channels and pour out, usually all over the drinker. To solve the puzzle, you had to figure out the correct order in which to drink from the cups. Often, you had to empty a specific cup first, which would then block a channel, allowing you to drink from the next one, and so on. It was a sequence puzzle, a test of trial and error. Fuddling cups appear in the archaeological record from the late medieval and early modern periods. The word fuddle itself means to confuse or intoxicate, so the name was quite literal. These were objects designed for amusement in a tavern or at a party. Like the puzzle jug, the fun was as much in watching others fail as it was in succeeding yourself. The design of the cups was often whimsical, sometimes shaped like animals, or with funny faces carved into them. The craftsmanship was impressive, requiring a potter to understand fluid dynamics to create the internal network of pipes correctly. The social dynamic was central. An experienced player might present the cup to a newcomer with a great show of confidence, knowing the poor person was about to get a shirt full of ale. It was a form of lighthearted hazing. But it was also a shared experience. Once you knew the secret, you were in on the joke. You became part of the group that could watch the next victim and smile knowingly. It was a game that created a small, temporary in-group in the tavern. The material culture historian James Hornell studied similar puzzle vessels and noted that their primary function was always social, meant to provoke laughter and conversation. But what secrets did the potters who made these cups take to their graves? Was there a master key to solving most fuddling cups, a common design principle they all followed? Did different regions have their own unique and more complex fuddling cup designs? How did a tavern owner first acquire such a specialized item? Did they commission it directly from a potter with a specific trick in mind? And were there ever competitions between potters to see who could create the most undrinkable set of cups? It's number 12, can you be a king for just one night? This game wasn't played every night, but on one special occasion, 12th night, the Feast of the Epiphany. The game was called King of the Bean. It was a tradition that cut across all social classes, from the royal court to the humblest peasant cottage. A special cake, known as a 12th cake, would be baked. Hidden inside the cake was a single dried bean. Everyone at the gathering would get a slice of the cake. The person who found the bean in their slice was crowned the King of the Bean for the rest of the night. Like, if a woman found it, she was the queen. The king or queen had absolute authority over the evening's festivities. Whatever they commanded, the rest of the party had to do, and their commands often involved a lot of drinking. The king could order a specific person to drink or make everyone drink at once. They could command someone to sing a song, tell a joke, or perform a silly dance, with a drink as the penalty for refusal. This tradition is incredibly old. Some historians trace it back to the Roman festival of Saturnalia, where a mock king was chosen to preside over the chaos. In medieval Europe, it was a huge event. The chronicler Samuel Pepys, writing a bit later in the 17th century, described his Twelfth Night parties in great detail, showing how long the tradition lasted. The game was a form of social release. For one night, the normal social order was turned upside down. A servant could be crowned king and order his master around. It was a world in miniature, a temporary kingdom of misrule. The drinking was a key part of this. The king of the bean would often have a royal cupbearer, whose job was to keep everyone's drink full. The king's toast had to be honored with a deep drink from everyone present. Refusing an order from the mock monarch was a serious breach of the game's etiquette. It was a game of performance and improvisation. The person crowned king had to be creative and funny, coming up with entertaining commands to keep the party going. It was a test of their social skills and their ability to command a room, even if it was just for a few hours. But what are the unwritten rules of this temporary monarchy? What happened if the real king or a powerful lord was present and a commoner was chosen as the king of the bean? How far could the mock king's commands go before they crossed the line? Were there regional variations in the game, perhaps using a different object in the cake, like a coin or a clove? And did people ever cheat, trying to manipulate who got the slice with the bean to ensure a fun-loving person became the king for the night? Number 11, would you risk a drink on a shove? Imagine a long, smooth wooden table polished by countless elbows and spilled drinks. At one end, you have a coin. The game is shove groat, or in its later form, shove ha'penny. The goal is to slide the coin, a groat in the medieval version, down the table and have it land as close to the far edge as possible without falling off. Its lines would often be carved or drawn on the table to create scoring zones. Landing in a specific zone got you points. This was a game of skill and fine motor control. It required a delicate touch. Push too gently and your coin falls short. Push too hard and it flies off the end of the table. And of course the penalty for a bad shot was to drink. In a team version, alternating players would shove their coins, trying to knock their opponent's coins out of scoring position or off the table entirely, a bit like shuffleboard or curling. This added a layer of strategy to the game. Shove groat was immensely popular in English taverns. It was so common that it was frequently banned by the authorities. King Henry VIII, a man who enjoyed his own fun, passed laws in the 1540s forbidding common laborers and servants from playing games like shove groat, fearing it would lead to gambling, debt, and neglecting their work. The fact that the king had to pass a law against it tells you just how widespread it was. People were clearly spending a lot of time and probably a lot of money on this simple game. The historian Joseph Strutt, in his 1801 book, The Sports and Pastimes of the People of England, describes shove groat as a fixture of a well houses and places of low resort. It was a working class game. It didn't require expensive equipment. Any flat surface and a coin would do. The drinking rules were simple. A player whose coin fell off the table would drink. The loser of the overall match would buy the next round. It was a quiet, focused game, a contrast to the louder, more boisterous games of chance. It was a test of nerve and precision, and doing it well while you were a few drinks in was a real challenge. But what details of this game have been worn away, like the tables it was played on? Were there specific techniques for shoving the coin and a flick of the finger, a push with the palm down, that were considered superior? Did players have their own personal lucky groats that they carried with them? How were disputes over a coin's position on a line settled without modern measuring tools? And were there famous shove groat champions, known from tavern to tavern for their unbeatable skill? Number 10. How would you play dice in the House of Fortune? This wasn't just any dice game, it was played on a special board. The game was called Gluckhaus, or House of Fortune. It was particularly popular in German-speaking lands in the late Middle Ages. The board was divided into numbered squares, usually from 2 to 12. Some of the squares were special. The number 7 was often depicted as a wedding or a place of celebration. The numbers 2 and 12 were often depicted as a pig and a king, respectively, representing the lowest and highest possible rolls with 2 dice. The game was simple. Players would take turns rolling 2 dice. The number they rolled corresponded to a square on the board. If the square was empty, they would place a coin or a token on it. If the square already had a token from another player, they would take it. But the special squares changed the rules. If you rolled a 7, you got married and had to place a token on the 7 square as a gift to the House of Fortune. These tokens on the 7 square were trapped there for the rest of the game. If you rolled a 12, the king, you won all the tokens on the entire board except for the ones on the 7 square. If you rolled a 2, the pig, you lost your turn and sometimes had to pay a penalty. The drinking version was a natural fit. Landing on an empty square was safe. Landing on a square with a token meant you won the token, and the person who lost it had to drink. Rolling a 7 and having to give a gift to the house meant you had to drink. Rolling the 2, the pig, definitely meant you had to drink. And rolling the 12, the king, meant you could make everyone else drink. It was a game of constant, unpredictable swings of fortune. The Gluckhaus board itself was often a beautiful object, a piece of folk art. Surviving examples from the 15th and 16th centuries are often intricately carved or painted with symbolic images for each number. The game combined the raw chance of a dice roll with a simple but engaging set of rules tied to the board. It was more structured than just rolling dice for a high number. The board created a visual narrative for the game's progress. As tokens piled up on certain numbers, the tension would build, with everyone hoping to either avoid those squares or be the one to finally claim the prize. But what are the forgotten stories behind this House of Fortune? Did the symbols on the board have deeper allegorical meanings that we no longer understand? Were there different board layouts in different regions with their own unique special squares and rules? How did players handle running out of tokens? Was that the point where they were out of the game? And was the game ever used for actual fortune telling, with the final position of the tokens on the board interpreted as a glimpse into the future? Number 9. What if you had to blow for your beer? This is a game of pure, silly physical skill. It was called Blow Point. The game involved a small, lightweight object, like a cork, a feather, or a small piece of wood. A circle would be drawn on the table, often with chalk. The players would sit around the table, and the object would be placed in the center of the circle. The goal was to blow the object into your opponent's section of the table or off the table on their side. It was essentially tabletop football, but, with your lungs. Players would have to control their breath, using short, sharp puffs to direct the object. Blowing too hard would send it flying wildly. Blowing too softly wouldn't move it enough. It was a game of surprising subtlety. You had to anticipate your opponent's moves, blowing at just the right angle to counter their puff and send the object into their territory. Blow point is mentioned in several texts from the 15th and 16th centuries as a children's game, but like many such games, it was quickly adopted by adults in taverns. The rules were simple. When the point or object entered your designated zone, you had to drink. If you blew it off the table on your own side, you had to drink. A full game might be played to a certain number of points, with the ultimate loser having to buy a round for everyone. Imagine a group of burly medieval soldiers, their faces red with effort, all leaning over a table, puffing their cheeks out, trying to blow a tiny feather across a line. It's a comical image, and that was the point. It was a game that stripped away any pretense of seriousness. It was impossible to look dignified while playing Blow Point. This made it a great icebreaker and a source of endless laughter. It required no equipment, no setup, and no deep thought, just a good pair of lungs and a sense of humor. The game is part of a long tradition of huffing games, as described by game historian David Parlett, where breath is the primary tool. But what are the finer points of this breathless competition? Were there specific rules about how close you could get your face to the table? Did players develop special techniques, like a rapid-fire series of puffs or a long, steady stream of air? What was the most common object used? Did different objects, with different weights and aerodynamics, completely change the game? And did people ever get into arguments about whether a puff of wind from a door opening had unfairly influenced the game's outcome? Number 8, would you dare ring the Devil's Knell? This was less a game and more a brutal challenge of endurance. It was called the Devil's Knell. The knell was a huge drinking vessel, often a ceremonial horn or a massive tankard that could hold many pints of ale. The challenge was to drink the entire contents in one go, without stopping for breath. Successfully doing so was a mark of incredible prowess. Failing had consequences. The ritual was simple. A challenger would stand up and declare their intention to ring the devil's knell. The huge vessel would be filled to the brim. The room would go quiet as the challenger put it to their lips. They had to drink it all. If they succeeded, they were a hero for the night, toasted by all, their drink paid for. If they failed, if they stopped, choked, or spilled it, they were an object of ridicule and had to pay a hefty forfeit, often buying a full round of drinks for everyone who witnessed their failure. This was a game of pure machismo. It wasn't about wit or skill, just raw physical capacity. Or traditions like this are found in many cultures. The Vikings had their drinking horns and epic toasts. The historian folklorist Christina Hole, in her book A Dictionary of British Folk Customs, describes numerous local traditions in England involving yard of ale glasses, which are a direct descendant of this kind of challenge. The Devil's Knell was the medieval equivalent. It was a spectacle, a piece of tavern theater. The name itself is evocative. Tolling a knell is ringing a bell for the dead. To ring the Devil's Knell was to perform a feat so extreme it was almost demonic, a challenge to your own physical limits. It was dangerous. Chugging that much alcohol that quickly could be, and probably was, fatal on occasion. But the glory and the bragging rights were immense. It was a way for a young man to make a name for himself, to prove his strength and stamina in a very public way. It was a game that blurred the line between celebration and self-destruction. But what are the specific origins of this daunting challenge? Was the Devil's Knell a specific famous vessel that was kept at a particular tavern, or was it a generic term for any large drinking challenge? What was the record for the fastest knell, and who held it? How often did these challenges end in brawls, when a mocked loser took offense at the crowd's jeers? And did anyone ever try to cheat, perhaps by using a vessel with a false bottom, or by getting a friend to distract the crowd at a crucial moment? Number 7. Could you pin your hopes on a wooden pin? This is the ancestor of modern bowling. It was called skittles or ninepins. The setup was simple. 9 wooden pins arranged in a diamond shape at one end of a lane. From the other end, a player would throw a wooden ball, trying to knock down as many pins as possible. It was played both outdoors on village greens and indoors in the long halls of castles or in specially built tavern alleys. Skittles was a game of skill, but it was also a perfect vehicle for drinking and gambling. Players would bet on each throw. A common way to play was to see who could knock down all the pins in the fewest throws. The loser of each frame would have to drink. Or a team game could be played, with the losing team responsible for the entire group's tab. The clatter of the ball and the crash of the pins were the soundtrack to many a medieval afternoon. The game is ancient. Archaeologists have found evidence of similar bowling games in ancient Egypt. By the Middle Ages, it was wildly popular across Europe. Manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries are filled with illuminations showing people playing skittles. It was another one of those games that the authorities constantly tried to regulate. They weren't just worried about gambling, they were worried that men were spending too much time playing skittles and not enough time practicing their archery, which was vital for the kingdom's defense. A 1366 proclamation by King Edward III of England explicitly banned games like skittles for this very reason. The rules could be complex. In some versions, one pin was larger or a different color. This was the kingpin. Knocking over the kingpin first might win you the game instantly, but knocking over only the kingpin might be a foul. In other versions, you had to knock down the pins in a specific order. These variations kept the game interesting. In the tavern, the drinking rules would be just as varied. You might have to drink for a gutter ball, or drink a number of times equal to the number of pins you left standing. It was a game that was easy to learn but hard to master, making it perennially popular. But what were the unwritten codes of conduct for a game of skittles? How were the lanes constructed, and were they standardized, or did every tavern have its own unique, bumpy, and challenging alley? Did players have their own customized balls, varying in weight and wood type? And what were the biggest skittles tournaments of the day, and what were the prizes beyond just money and ale? Number 6. What happens when you add drinking to hazard? Hazard was the king of medieval dice games. It was complex, fast-paced, and wildly popular, especially among the upper classes. It's the ancestor of the modern casino game of craps. The rules are a bit complicated, but the essence is this one player, the caster, throws 2 dice. Their first roll sets a main number. They then have to roll that number again before they roll a chance number, which is determined by a specific set of rules based on their first roll. It was a game of shifting odds and quick calculations. Chaucer, in the Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, mentions hazard by name. His partner gives a long sermon against the evils of gambling, and hazard is his prime example. He describes young men in taverns swearing and lying and wasting their money on the cursed roll of the dice. This tells us two things. The game was extremely common, and it had a dangerous reputation. It was a game where fortunes could be won and lost in a single night. Turning hazard into a drinking game was easy. The stakes didn't have to be money, they could be drinks. The caster might have to drink if they failed to make their point. The other players who would bet on the caster's success or failure would drink if their bets were wrong. Because the game was so fast, with multiple rolls and bets happening in quick succession, the drinking could become very rapid. It was a game for people who enjoyed risk and excitement. The language of hazard was rich with slang. Terms like main, chance, and nicking, winning on the first roll, were part of the game's culture. Playing hazard was a sign of being a man of the world, someone who was comfortable with risk. It was often played in the less reputable corners of a city, in gambling dens and rowdy taverns, where the ale was cheap and the tempers were short. Brawls, over accusations of cheating with loaded dice were common. It was a game with a definite edge. But what are the deeper strategies of hazard that have been lost? Were there professional hazard players who made a living from it, and what were their secrets? How did the complex rules get passed on in a largely illiterate society? Did the design of the dice themselves with pips instead of numbers affect how the game was played and understood? And what were the biggest, most legendary games of hazard ever played, where the stakes, whether in gold or in ale, were astronomically high? Number 5, would you play tag with a drunken bear? This one sounds more like a fraternity prank than a medieval game, but it was real. It was called Buff the Bear, or Hoodman's Blind. It was a version of Blind Man's Buff, but with a rougher tavern-ready twist. One player, the bear, would be blindfolded. The other players would circle around him, taunting him, prodding him, and sometimes hitting him with knotted cloths or small bags. The bear's job was to catch one of his tormentors. The person who was caught then became the new bear. But there was a catch. The bear had to guess who he had caught, just by touch. Or if he guessed correctly, the captured person was the new bear. If he guessed wrong, he had to take a large drink and remain the bear. This added a memory and sensory element to the game. You had to pay attention to who was where, even when you were being spun around and disoriented. This game was pure physical chaos. It was popular at festive gatherings where there was a lot of space, either outdoors or in a large hall. It was a game that required energy and a high tolerance for pain. The buffs, or hits, were supposed to be playful, but in a room full of drinking men, they could easily get out of hand. The game is depicted in medieval art, most famously in a painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder called Children's Games 1560, which shows that its roots are in childhood play. But like so many games, adults adapted it for their own, more boisterous purposes. The drinking element made the game progressively more difficult and more hilarious. The longer you were the beer, the more you had to drink, which made your balance worse and your senses duller, making it even harder to catch someone. It was a downward spiral of drunken stumbling. For the other players, the fun was in the risk of getting close enough to taunt the bear without being caught. It was a game of agility, noise, and controlled violence, a perfect outlet for pent-up energy in a world that demanded hard physical labor. But what were the social boundaries of this chaotic game? How hard was it acceptable to hit the bear? Did people use a safe word if things got too rough? Were there versions of the game with different rules, perhaps involving more than one blindfolded player? And what kinds of injuries were common from a game that involved a blindfolded drunk person swinging their arms wildly in a crowded room? Number 4, how many drinks is a night worth? This game takes us away from the rowdy tavern and into the more refined, but no less competitive, world of the educated elite. It was called the Philosopher's Game, or Rhythmomacha. It was an incredibly complex strategy board game, a sort of medieval super chess. It was played on a board that looked like two chessboards stuck together. The pieces were not characters, but numbers arranged in different shapes like circles, squares, and triangles. The goal of the game was to capture your opponent's pieces, but the capture rules were based on complex mathematical relationships. For example, a piece with the number 3 could capture an opponent's piece with the number 9 if it was 3 spaces away, 3 times 3 dash 9. Or two of your pieces, a 2 and a 4, could team up to capture an 8 that was between them. 2 plus 4, 6. So wait, the rules are more complex, often involving addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. It was a game that required a deep understanding of arithmetic and number theory, as it was known in the Middle Ages. This game was played by university scholars, monks, and aristocrats. It was seen as a mental exercise, a way to train the mind in the principles of mathematics and logic. The book The Scholar and the Courtesan by the 12th century writer Jacques de Vitry describes the game as a worthy pursuit for learned men. So how does this become a drinking game? Inevitably, any game played by humans can become a drinking game. When a piece was captured, the player who lost the piece had to take a drink. Imagine two monks deep in their monastery's library playing a silent, intense game of Rhythmomachia. The only sound is the quiet click of the pieces on the board, and then after a long calculation, one monk captures a key piece. The other side reaches for a hidden flask of wine or brandy and takes a solemn drink. A more boisterous version could be played in a nobleman's hall, with spectators cheering and the loser of a piece having to drain a goblet of wine. The alcohol would have made the already complex calculations of the game nearly impossible, leading to a cascade of errors and more drinking. But so much about this intellectual game is shrouded in mystery. What were the complete standardized rules, as they seem to vary from text to text? Were there different schools of Rhythmomachia strategy, like the different openings in chess? How were the game sets themselves made? And were they luxury items for the rich, or something a student could craft themselves? And did anyone ever get so drunk playing it that they started to see the numbers on the pieces move on their own? Number 3, could you win a game of pure chance? This game is the essence of simplicity. It's a dice game for people who don't want to think. Or it's called Passage. It was played with 3 dice. The goal was to roll a total of 10 or more. That's it. If you rolled 10 or higher, you won. If you rolled 9 or lower, you lost. It was a fast, simple, binary game of luck. Passage was the perfect tavern game for a loud, drunk crowd. There were no complex rules to remember, no strategy to debate. You just rolled the dice and immediately knew if you had won or lost. Players would bet against the house or against each other on each roll. The drinking application is obvious, is you roll. If you lose, you drink. If you win, the other person drinks. The dice could be passed around a circle, with each person rolling in turn, creating a steady, rhythmic pace of drinking. The game is mentioned in many legal documents from the period, usually in lists of unlawful games. Its pure reliance on chance made it a prime target for moralists and lawmakers who saw gambling as a sin and a social problem. Because the odds are slightly against the player, there are more combinations that total less than 10 or more. It was a game that could quickly drain a person's pockets or get them very drunk very fast. The historian Charles Cotton, in his 1674 book, The Complete Gamester, provides a clear description of Passage, showing its longevity. He calls it a game for the rabble and notes its quickness. A whole game could be over in a single roll. This made it ideal for settling small disputes or making quick decisions. Who pays for this round? Let's roll for it. Who has to go out in the rain to fetch more wood? Let's play a quick game of Passage. It was a utility game, a tool for instant, random resolution, but what are the hidden social aspects of such a simple game? Did people have lucky charms or rituals they performed before rolling the dice in a game of Passage? Were there common forms of cheating, like using dice that were weighted to favor low numbers? How did the game get its name sauced? Passage referred to passing the dice, or passing a certain numerical threshold. And in a game with no skill, how did players explain their wins and losses, other than by appealing to the mysterious whims of Lady Luck? Number 2, could you talk your way out of a drink? This was a game of wit, rhyme, and quick thinking. It was called Crambo. It was a rhyming game that could be played by 2 people or a large group. The first player would say a word or a line of poetry. The next player had to respond with a line that rhymed. The catch was that you couldn't repeat a rhyme that had already been used. The game would continue, with each person adding a rhyming line, until someone was stumped. If a player couldn't come up with a rhyme in a reasonable amount of time, or if they repeated a rhyme, they had to drink. The game could be simple, with single rhyming words, or it could be complex, with players having to create entire rhyming couplets that also had to make some kind of sense. It was a test of vocabulary and mental agility. Crambo was a popular parlor game among the educated classes, but simpler versions were played in taverns as well. It required no equipment, just a shared language and a bit of creativity. It was a social game that encouraged cleverness and humor. The rhymes would often become silly or bawdy as the game went on and the ale flowed. The game is mentioned in the writings of Jonathan Swift in the early 18th century, but its roots as a simple rhyming forfeit game are much older. The pressure would mount as the game went on. The easy rhymes for a word like ale, pale, stale, tail, whale would be used up quickly. Players would have to dig deep, coming up with more obscure or creative rhymes. This is where the fun came from. Someone might come up with a brilliant, unexpected rhyme, earning a laugh from the group. Someone else might stumble, their mind gone blank, leading to their forfeit and a round of good-natured jeering. And it was a game that celebrated language itself, but what were the unwritten rules that governed this war of words? Was there a judge to decide if a rhyme was legitimate or too much of a stretch? Did the game have different levels of difficulty, perhaps requiring a specific meter or rhythm as well as just a rhyme? How did players handle regional accents and different pronunciations that might affect whether a word rhymed or not? And what were the most legendary epic rounds of Crambo ever played, where the rhymes became so elaborate they formed a spontaneous collaborative poem? Number 1, would you put a flaming raisin in your mouth? This game sounds absolutely insane by modern safety standards. It was called Snapdragon. It was a game typically played during the winter, especially around Christmas. A large, shallow bowl would be filled with brandy or another high-proof spirit. Raisins or other dried fruits would be placed in the brandy. The lights in the room would be turned off, and the brandy would be set on fire. It would burn with a ghostly blue flame. The game was to pluck the raisins out of the burning brandy and eat them. So that's it. You had to be quick snatching the raisin before your fingers got burned by the flames or the hot liquid. The raisins themselves would be searingly hot. It was a game of bravado, a test of your nerve and your resistance to pain. Snapdragon was popular in England from at least the 16th century, but its folk traditions are likely older. It was a dramatic, theatrical game. In a dark room, the only light would be the eerie blue flames dancing in the bowl, illuminating the faces of the players as they leaned in, full of apprehension and excitement. The name itself is thought to come from the snapping sound of the players' mouths as they quickly snatched and ate the hot fruit. It was a game as much for the spectators as for the players. The drinking element was built right in. The brandy in the bowl was the prize and the source of the danger. After the game, the remaining warm, fruit-infused brandy would be shared among the players. It was a game that combined fear, excitement, and reward. It was a perfect, memorable centerpiece for a winter celebration. It was a piece of interactive theater that felt genuinely dangerous and magical. But what are the truly terrifying details we've forgotten about this fiery game? What was the actual rate of injury from playing Snapdragon? How many people ended their Christmas with seriously burned fingers or tongues? Were there secret techniques to snatching the raisins safely, like wetting your fingers first? Did people ever use other, more flammable spirits? And with what disastrous results? And fundamentally, what possessed them to think that a game involving putting your hand into a bowl of flaming alcohol was a good idea for a fun family evening?